Trinitarians, and welcome to more lost and forgotten Christian communities. Now, last week, when we considered the Church of the East, we learned, or at least were reminded of the fact that they were some of the first, if not the first, to evangelize China. And this is what we keep seeing over and over again with these Eastern churches, is they are often the first to have some kind of encounter. And this week's session is no different, because this week is all about the early Islamic invasions and the Christians that first encountered them and then lived under Islamic rule. When the Arab geographer al-Makdisi visited the mosque in Damascus, he narrated a conversation he had had with his uncle sometime earlier. As a young man, he had expressed his dismay and conviction that the first caliphs, or rulers over Islam, were wrong to squander the wealth of the Muslims on the Mosque of Damascus. This is the Great Mosque of Damascus as it appears today. This young man thought instead that the new caliph should have spent his money to maintain roads and water cisterns and to restore the fortresses. This would have been much more meritorious for this growing new empire. "Don't you believe it, my son," said his uncle, "because the caliph, when he saw Syria, the land of the Christians, it was so full of beautiful churches of seductive appearance and vast renown, like Anastasius in Jerusalem and the church in Edessa. He said he had to give Muslims a mosque to divert their attention from these churches, and so made the Great Mosque of Damascus one of the wonders of the world. In the same way, Abd al-Malik, a very well-known caliph from the early 8th century that we're going to come back to. So al-Malik, when he saw the immense and dominating dome of the Church of Anastasius, or the Church of Resurrection in Jerusalem, feared that it would dominate the hearts of the Muslims, and he therefore erected the dome, which we see on the rock." So we see here at the very beginning of the encounter between Christians and Muslims, the proximity here in Jerusalem. If you've ever had the blessing to be there, I have not yet had that experience, but you see the proximity between the Church of the Resurrection in the bottom part of your screen, and of course the 8th century Dome of the Rock above it, and seemingly, especially from this perspective, really dominating. So this pointed moment directs us to one of the primary elements of early Christian-Muslim relations, and that is the need that each tradition felt to distinguish themselves from the other. And it's very difficult to get away from this, and so a lot of the materials that we're going to be looking at today from this early period from Christian sources are getting at this, trying to distinguish and trying to live within this new authority. The political and religious need for the new rulers was, of course, to claim their superiority and their rightness, and the need for the existing Christian traditions to preserve and survive this new challenge, as well as claim their rightness. Today, I will primarily discuss how Eastern Christians reacted to the Islamic invasions, how they were treated by these new authorities, and then how they contributed to and eventually really negotiated their way through, you might say, the halls of power of early caliphs. The spread of the Islamic invasions is fast. Any of you that have studied this over the years will be very familiar with this. It's blindingly fast. So Muhammad dies in 632 in Arabia, and almost immediately his successors begin conquering to the north. And so this map shows you a succession of periods of invasion, taking us all the way up to 750 for Europeanists. That's really at the time of Charlemagne. You can see in the north of that map, the kingdom of the Franks. But thinking about some of the Christian centers we've been studying over the last few weeks, here's a quick list of dates as to when they fell to these new rulers. Damascus, 635, Jerusalem, 637, Antioch, 637, Edessa, 640, Alexandria, 642, and Ctesiphon in Iraq near Baghdad today, 645. For the first century or so, the capital of the Islamic Empire, the Umayyad Empire is what it's called. It's going to be Damascus. And then by the 9th century, the center of power moves to Baghdad. And that's where we're going to end up at the end of our time today. There are a lot of reasons militarily that can be given for why this spread happened so quickly. I think the reason that makes the most sense to us, given our present class context, is just how worn down the Byzantine and the Byzantine Eastern Roman army and the Sasanian, the Persian army, were, because of course, as we know, they've been battling over that central section in Syria for the first 2 decades of the 600s. The early Muslim rulers are now in control of an incredibly diverse population. In the west of the region are mostly Christians. However, in the old Sasanian Empire, there was obviously a huge mix of Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and many others. Using techniques from the Sasanian Empire, as well as very clear instructions from the Quran, Muslims imposed special taxes on these particular groups of the population. And one of the ways in which they did this was by setting up a special tax called a jizya. And this was applied to males that would be of military age, because they wouldn't necessarily be fighting in the Islamic army. And the broader blanket term that's used to describe the restrictions and protections, if you will, for these groups of Christians and Jews is known as dhimmi. And in Islam, there's a special category within the Quran that Christians and Jews fell into, and they were known as people of the book, because they revered the Torah and the Old Testament, which Muslims also do as well. And so they were seen early on through the teachings of the Quran that they should be treated differently, because unlike the polytheists in Arabia who worshipped man-made idols, Jews and then Christians fell into the same traditions as the early Muslims. What was this life really like? Christians were allowed to stay where they lived, so there doesn't appear to be mass deportations. They could follow their own religious laws. However, this is on condition that they submitted to Muslim law in civil and criminal matters and also paid this special tax. So one historian has described this as being societies within a larger society, or a kind of ghettoized existence. Between the 7th and the 11th centuries, these minority communities were considered to be, of course, second-class citizens. Many had to wear special clothing. They could not publicly display their faith, and of course, they needed to refrain from proselytizing or trying to evangelize to Muslims. And if you read the Quran, this is one of the words of advice that's given a number of times, is don't try to evangelize to Christians, because they'll just try to do the same thing to you. It's not unusual for Christian churches, schools, and monasteries to be regularly taken over. I think that the image that I get is kind of a consistent sort of squeezing. What life was really like for Christians in Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia is difficult to tell, and certainly it varied from region to region, and the severity of the restrictions would depend on the viewpoint that each individual caliph at different times actually had of Christians. So sometimes it's stricter, and sometimes it's more lenient or tolerant. One of the bleaker depictions that I have read is from a Harvard divinity professor, historian of the Middle Ages, by the name of Madigan. says that despite examples that we have of pretty outstanding collaboration, and I'm going to give you some of those examples towards the end, that's really, he says, largely an imagined utopia, is his phrase. In many Christian communities, Christians were treated quite badly, and in some even persecuted. However, I would say it's worth pointing out that in the pre-Christian Roman Empire, where there's systematic persecution, and there's also periods of systematic persecution in Sasanians, there doesn't seem to be evidence that in these early Islamic invasions, there was ever systematic persecution by the state of Christians, though there certainly are martyrs that have come out of this moment in the first Christian-Muslim encounter as well. Despite the Quran's injunction to not engage with people of the book and just leave them be in their separate ways of life, Madigan also claims that there are many Muslims who instead saw Christians as religious enemies and saw the kind of open religious dialogue that's going on in the city of Baghdad as a negative. So just as there's going to be a variety of reactions on the part of Christians, there's also a variety of reactions on the part of Muslims to this new state. By the time the Ottoman Empire is on the rise in 1300, Christians have become minority populations in the Middle East because so many of them have converted for a number of reasons. Obviously, it was economically and socially advantageous as the decades progressed to do so, but no doubt there are other reasons why they would convert as well. So on the screen here, I wanted to remind us, who are the Christian groups that are first encountering Muslims? These can be divided down into three that we've already considered. The Melkites, who are Chalcedon affirming, generally in the Palestine, today Lebanon, Syria region. They are aligned with the teachings of Byzantium and all of their church councils. The second are the Miaphysites, the one nature group. And this, of course, is both the Syrian Orthodox contingent as well as the Egypt, who over the next century or so will come to be called Copts, because that separates their community from the vast use of Arabic that's coming at this point. And then, of course, the Church of the East, which we looked at last week, which we might primarily call Nestorian, but again, it's a mixture of church traditions, very much coming out of a broad understanding of a Syriac tradition. Early on, the new rulers had to rely on Syrian and Greek Christians to help them carry out administrative tasks. But as the decades progressed, as more Muslims are available, both through conversion and just generational increase, Christians have fewer and fewer positions in the government. By the end of the 7th century, the famous Caliph Abd al-Malik is having gold coins minted, and on them you can see here the distinct desire to separate Islam as a new religion from that of Christianity. There is no God but Allah alone. He has no partner, right? And this is an indirect or very direct reference to Christ. And then on the flip side, it said, God is one, God is eternal. He was not born, nor does he give birth. And as we're going to see later in a primary source, very early on, these Muslim rulers are quick to point out and draw the lines of demarcation theologically that separate Christians and Muslims, of course, most of it stemming around the person of Jesus Christ. Abd al-Malik is also responsible for establishing the Dome of the Rock, inside which there are very similar phrases that we might call anti-Trinitarian. So I'm not going to read those out. You can look at that on your own. But needless to say, again, this drawing of lines and distinctions is happening quite rapidly. So this inscription, this Arabization through the Dome of the Rock, or Islamization, we might say, points out a number of helpful things to us, I think, about understanding this early period. First, of course, is that these new Arab invasions are motivated by more than military conquest. It's the beginning of a new religion. And this is something that the very first Christians don't always understand, or they're not always willing to accept. Secondly, that these invasions bring about a massive lingual shift in a region that had held primarily to Greek, Syriac, and Persian. And this meant that Christians, again here, have to be nimble and have to learn how to express their beliefs in Arabic, much the way the early church councils are trying to pick through and navigate through Greek. But in a complicated twist, these Christians now have to determine how to use Arabic in a way that differentiate their understanding of the Godhead from that of Muslims, right? So when you say Allah as a Christian, what other Arabic phrases do you need to include to make it clear you're talking about Trinitarian monotheism, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as opposed to Unitarian monotheism of Islam, and this central core belief, right, that God is one. At the same time that the Dome of the Rock and the coins are being minted, there's also all kinds of Muslim expressions of faith that are being set up publicly. So this is the point early on. We start to see public calls to prayer 5 times a day, the reciting of the Quran on Fridays, along with a kind of, we might say, a sermon, as well as the establishment of the period of fasting, right? So we're starting to see the emergence of what we now would call the 5 pillars. There are even road signs in these newly conquered regions that announce the Shahada in Arabic, which of course is, there is no God, but God in Muhammad is his prophet. So Arabization is going on, but there's also a nod to accommodation, and these two, if we're thinking specifically about Christians and Muslims, these two groups trying to coexist to some extent. So early on, for example, in the mosque in Damascus, the Muslims would pray in the east corner of the church, and the Christians would pray in the west. After at least a generation or so, the then caliph says, there's too many Muslims, this isn't working anymore. Christians, you can't use this space anymore. Church of John the Baptist, which the Christians had built on top of a pagan site. So the Christians are ousted from the Church of the John Baptist, and the caliph says, but I'm not going to touch any more of your other churches. You can keep all your other churches. So it's this constant dance of accommodation, always with awareness that this new power has this new religion that they're spreading. So by 750, Islamic rule has extended to at least 50% of the world's Christian population, and that is basically from modern day Pakistan all the way to modern day Spain. So it's a huge area that really allowed a lot of trade to pass back and forth. The economic history of these early Islamic empires is really fascinating. During this period of the 8th to 10th centuries, this is when we see Christians working and navigating and responding. Part of this we can see with the extent to which they do or do not accept Arabic as a new language. So for instance, the Christians in Spain are quite eager to take on Arabic as a new language, while they also try to hold on to Latin Christian traditions. On the other hand, it perhaps does not come as a surprise to you that the church in Ethiopia and the church in Armenia never accept Arabic as a language. And then in the middle of these really is where we're going to sit for the rest of our time today, which is the church communities of Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia, really this Syriac tradition. And they really have to, in the most significant ways, figure out how to adopt Arabic and figure out how to live within this new regime. So our first reaction, Christian reaction, and one of the first ones first persons that often gets pointed to is John of Damascus. So you'll see from his life dates there, he lives just in the generation just after the first invasions. He's a Melkite, which means he's Chalcedon affirming. He wrote a text called the Fount of Knowledge, and this was a huge compendium of works of early church fathers. And so it's not specifically about Muslims, but the reason why it's interesting to historians is because he includes a small section, and you can find this online today. He includes a small section in which he refers to the heresy of the Ishmaelites. And so when historians talk about early Christians seeing the commonalities between Islam and Christianity, they're often pointing at John of Damascus, who wants to say, look, this is not a full-blown new religion. This is just another Christian heresy. So that is one quite well-known early example. Another way in which Christians reacted or reinterpreted early on Islamic tradition is through their twist on the Bahira Legend. So the Bahira Legend emerges in Islamic tradition, and it's the story and the belief. It's not in the Quran, but it's a story that emerged that Muhammad, when he was a young man, was on a trek from Mecca up into Syria, right? Because he's nomadic Arab tribesmen. And on the way, he encounters a Christian monk, and that Christian monk, in the Islamic version of the story, says, I see the seal of prophethood on this young man. Christians then will give their own version of this story and legend and say, no, the true version of what happened to Muhammad earlier in his childhood is that, yes, he was on this trek into Syria. He encounters an Nestorian monk who teaches him all about Christianity. Muhammad absorbs this teaching, and then later he goes and gives a distorted version of Christian theology in the form of the Quran. So very early on, you can see these two traditions interpreting and reinterpreting common stories and common beliefs. The third early reaction to Islam that's often pointed out is called the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. And this is sort of written as if it was written by this 4th century Turkish martyr bishop. But this is a sort of text I don't think any of us are surprised by, in the sense that these invasions are interpreted as part of God's continuing unfolding plan. It's interpreted by the author as punishment for sin. But the author also says, look, this is not these invasions do not divert us from God's plan for the end of the world as he's laid out in the book of Daniel. Rather, the depredations of the Arabs are part of God's plan for the era of punishment for sin that is destined to usher in the final days of world history. So interesting, right? As we often see in our own time and in generations prior to us, there's often an attempt to interpret new, unexpected political events in light of how we understand Scripture, and the same is happening here. I included on your screen a 13th century Psalter map, which is Western, but it's just delightful. And again, it shows that in this ancient Christian concept and mindset, that Christ is over all of time and over all of creation. So he's seated in glory. At the top of that map, in the center of the map, is Jerusalem, and the 3 known continents at the time circle around it. And we'll look at that a little bit more in depth when we talk about the Black Death and people's reactions to that. One of the longest traditions within the Christian faith is that of the necessity for the believer to sometimes provide a defense or an apology of the faith. So this is sometimes modeled on Christ, who does this, references this in relation to the Sanhedrin, right? You may need to provide a defense. And of course, we see this for early Christians when they're coming up against pagan Roman authorities. In the year 781, during the reign of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, Mahdi, a debate occurs for 2 days between the Patriarch of the Church of the East, Timothy, or Timothy of Baghdad, Timothy I, and this Caliph, Mahdi. And so what I want to do is read out a portion of this dialogue. It's quite lengthy. There's a 1928 English translation that you would be able to get a hold of and read. It's delightful, it's challenging, and it also shows us most clearly how this new encounter and interaction between Christians and Muslims is being handled at the highest level. On your screen right now, I wanted to make reference to another, today I guess we would say interfaith dialogue. Somehow that doesn't seem quite precise enough for what's going on here in this older context, but this is Saint Francis of Assisi on the left and the then Egyptian Sultan, and this is around the time of the Crusades. And oftentimes in the West, we look at this, and this is a very legendary, we know that was a meeting as to what they actually talked about, and precisely what happened is a little bit more up for grabs, but there are many, many beautiful frescoes all over the West, particularly in Italy, of this interaction, which apparently was very congenial. Of course, St. Francis goes with the intention of trying to convert the Sultan, and the Sultan has no intention of doing this. On the right-hand side of your screen is a image of a text from the library of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, which is one of the most fabulous libraries that actually has survived. And this is another take on this form of early Christian-Muslim dialogue, and this is a dialogue between an emir, or an Islamic religious leader, and a monk. This is not sort of an imperial leader and a church leader. It's a little bit socially lower down the scale, but nevertheless, it shows us that these Syriac Christians were some of the first to produce writings for instruction for the church, for how do you engage with and talk to Muslims. So, Timothy of Baghdad. So Timothy is born in northern Iran in Haza to a wealthy family. His uncle is a bishop, and early on, Timothy goes and studies the scriptures. He studies liturgy, philosophy, Aristotle. He does all of this in a monastery. For a time, he was a monk near the present Iraqi city of Mosul. He is appointed bishop and patriarch in Baghdad, the new Abbasid Islamic capital. He sponsored missionary work in Central Asia, India, China, and even Tibet. And he's the one that's behind a lot of what we were considering last week. He knew Syriac, Greek, and Arabic, as well as Persian and Hebrew. He copied books himself. He encouraged the work of translation of texts from Greek and Syriac into Arabic within the church. He even wrote a book of astronomy, because this is the point in history in which the disciplines and the subjects are so marvelously interwoven. They're not siloed as they are today. He even translated portions of Aristotle for the Caliph into Arabic from a Syriac translation. And it becomes clear from what we're going to be reading out that he was clearly friends with the Caliph. So this conversation happens over 2 days. It seems to be a private conversation. Timothy wrote it down himself afterwards, and historians are pretty certain that this is fairly accurate. Obviously, it's not verbatim, but all indications are that this event did happen and that the conversation ensued the way we read it. So the Caliph asks the Patriarch, Timothy, a seemingly endless set of questions about the Christian faith, and the primary topics for dispute include: how can God be three and still one? If the Paraclete or the counselor that Jesus refers to coming after him was perhaps, as according to Islamic tradition, actually Muhammad and not the Holy Spirit. And of course, there's the perennial question about the virgin birth. Just how can a carnal woman give birth to a materialless God? So I've pulled up a few excerpts of this that I'm going to read through before we turn finally to talk more about this Baghdad intellectual Christian tradition. And our king said to me, how was that eternal one born in time? And I answered, it is not in his eternity, and he was born of Mary, O our king, but in his temporalness and humanity. And our king said to me, there are therefore two distinct beings. One is eternal and God from God, as you said, and the other temporal. The latter is therefore a pure man from Mary. And I retorted, Christ is not two beings, O king, nor two sons, but Son and Christ are one. There are in him two natures, one of which belongs to the Word, and the other which is from Mary, clothed itself with the Word God. And the king said, they are therefore two, one of whom created and fashioned, and the other uncreated and unfashioned. And I said to him, we do not deny the duality of natures, O king, nor their mutual relations, but we profess that both of them constitute one Christ and one Son. And the king retorted, if he is one, he is not two, and if he is two, he is not one. And I replied to him, a man is one, while in reality he is two. One in his composition and individuality, and two in the distinction found between his soul and his body. The former is invisible and spiritual, and the latter visible and corporeal, our king. Together with the insignia of his kingdom is also one king and not two, however great may be the difference that separates him from his dresses. In the same way, the word of God, together with the clothings of humanity which he put on Mary, is one and the same Christ and not two, although there is in him the natural difference between the word God and his humanity, and the fact that he is one does not preclude the fact that he is also two. The very same Christ and Son is indeed known and confessed as one, and the fact is that he is also two does not imply confusion or mixture, because the known attributes of his natures are kept in one person of the Son and Christ. So there is an echo here in their debate and discussion of some of these early church councils. The tone of this, I think, is also fascinating because it's very collegial and perhaps in a way serves as an example for us. The next day, Timothy says, I had an audience of His Majesty. Such audiences had constantly taken place previously, sometimes for the affairs of state and some other times for the love of wisdom and learning, which was burning in the soul of His Majesty. He is a lovable man and loves also learning when he finds it in other people. And on this account, he directed against me the weight of his objections whenever necessary. After I had paid him my usual respects as King of Kings, he began to address me and converse with me, not in a harsh and haughty tone, since harshness and haughtiness are remote from his soul, but in a sweet and benevolent way. And we know that this document was passed around to Christian communities amongst the Church of the East for quite some time. And this next passage actually makes me chuckle. And the king said, it is very easy for your tongue, O Catholicus, to prove the existence of that Lord and God, and the existence also of that consubstantial servant, Jesus Christ, and to draw conclusions sometimes or to abstain from them some other times. But the minds and the will of rational beings are induced to not follow your mind, which is visible in your conclusions, but the law of nature and the inspired books. So the Caliph is pushing back and say, well, it makes sense in your mind, but I prefer to follow the law of nature and the books of the tradition. And presumably here, he's not only referring to the Quran, he's referring to the Torah. And I replied, "O victorious king, I have proved my words that I have uttered in the first day and today both from nature and from books." So he's saying, I'm using the same epistemic or epistemological support here for my arguments. So far as arguments from nature are concerned, I argued, confirmed, and corroborated my words, sometimes from the soul with its mind and its reason, sometimes from the fire with its light and its heat, sometimes from the apple with its scent and its savor, and some other times from your majesty and from the rational and royal flowers that grew from it, Musa and Harun, the sons of your majesty. So he's saying, I'm using a battery of all kinds of different authorities to make my argument. As to the inspired books, I prove the object under discussion sometimes from Moses, sometimes from David, both figures that the caliph would respect. And some other times I appealed to the Quran as a witness to prove my statement. And they go on with their dialogue in this kind of really thick discussion, sometimes seems combative, but always the tone seems to be respectful both ways. Of course, someone might argue that Patriarch Timothy had no choice in his dependence on the caliph, despite this kind acquaintanceship between them. He had no choice if he wanted to remain head of the tolerated Church of the East. However, numerous times in this history of early Christian and Muslim interactions in the capital, there does seem to be, under many caliphs, an imperial willingness to listen and to tolerate their Christian subjects. Again, this is a complicated history. It is neither fully tolerant, nor is it always fully combative or fully oppressive and violent. So while some church leaders were producing texts to both help Christians in the defense of faith, as well as to fight against increasing and willing conversions of Christians to Islam, there are other Syrian Christian monks that are busy translating works from the church into Arabic. The most significant of this work happened in a lot of pre-existing monasteries, and I've put two on the screen there. One, Marsaba, outside of Bethlehem, perhaps some of you have been there, and then of course the very, very famous St. Catherine's Monastery with the fabulous library that has preserved so much for the Christian tradition. What's interesting is that both of these monasteries, while they were Chalcedon affirming with the new Islamic takeover of Palestine and Egypt, now they find themselves separated from Byzantium and from the rest of the Chalcedon affirming churches. So they welcome Syriac monks to come and translate with them. And you do get a sense that there's a lot of communication and a lot of travel within the Islamic empires going on between Christian groups. Lastly, the work of Timothy of Baghdad for the Church of the East, as well as the patronage of the caliphs, brings us to one of the most provocative moments in early Christian, Muslim, and Jewish relationships, and that is Baghdad's House of Wisdom, which was a library and a center of study from really the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. In the generation after Timothy, the Patriarch, a Christian, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, like Timothy, Hunayn is an apologist, so he makes strong defenses for the Christian faith, but he's also a philosopher who believed that philosophy should serve also as a practical way of life. And so in this regard, he actually wrote a piece that I'm just going to simply call the Kitab, because I can't in Arabic pronounce the full title, but it's basically a compendium of life quotes and wisdom from famous philosophers within and outside of the Christian tradition, because he felt that philosophy should serve as a practical purpose for people who would make the effort to inform their daily lives and the policies of their societies with the best moral insights philosophy has to offer. I think this is interesting because it suggests that there are Christian thinkers living and working in Baghdad that is Muslim dominated, but they're trying to find a way through that would enable harmonious living for diverse populations in the Abbasid Empire by turning to the wisdom of some of these older philosophers. And here on the screen, you see an image of the House of Wisdom and all of the different scientific instruments that are being used, including an astrolabe. And the quote there just shows you sort of the breadth of interest that these Abbasid caliphs have with expanding the fields of science and philosophy. And it's these Syriac Christians that are living and working alongside their Muslim and Jewish counterparts that are doing so much of this important translation work. I think these last two examples of Timothy and of Hunayn give us this idea that there is a strength in the Christian intellectual and language work that meant that Christians still had a significant place, even in the Abbasid Empire. It shows us that Syriac-speaking Christians enabled through their work of translation some of the significant scientific and mathematic achievements that we rely on today, such as the Arabic numeral system, algebra, algorithms, and even the concept of quarantining patients with varying symptoms into different parts of a hospital. My understanding is that one of, if not the first place that starts is in Baghdad during this point in time. The work that's going on in the Abbasid Empire medically and scientifically is so advanced by our standards that it makes the Muslims who encounter the Crusades centuries after this scoff at how backwards Frankish or Central European medicine seems to be. The Arabic translations of Aristotle's natural philosophies by Syriac Christian translators in Baghdad would then travel across the Islamic world to Spain, that you see pictured there on the bottom of your screen, and they would be held in the Library of Toledo, where in the 12th century, Christian monks that were allowed to study there alongside Muslims would first discover and translate Aristotle's natural philosophies from Arabic into Latin. This textual access then spurs Thomas Aquinas and his great reconciling work of Summa Theologica, in which he strove to prove that as Christians, we need not forfeit our faith nor the wisdom that medievals found in Aristotle's teachings. So while as Christians today, we may often ask, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What's the relationship between these great philosophical traditions of ancient Greece and the Judeo-Christian tradition? We ought perhaps to add to that question that it is only thanks to the work of Syriac-speaking Christians in Edessa and Ctesiphon and Baghdad that we can even ask that question at all, because they did all of this translating work for us. Our own Western European history from the later Middle Ages into the crisis of the scientific revolution is arguably provided for us by these Christians that seemingly live worlds away. And of course, it's Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other demographics in the Middle East and beyond that in the early 1340s would face the first onslaught of the greatest plague still recorded in human history, the Black Death. And in our last session together, that is the moment that I want to consider. So what's my takeaway for these first Christian encounters with Islam in the first few centuries? Well, really overall, again, it continues to be one of resilience. So what then is our takeaway about Christians living in the shadow of the mosque in the first few centuries. Really, I think, again, it just shows us that these Christian communities from Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia are churches that are able to somehow maintain great resilience. They live through incredible experiences as minorities, living under certain restrictions that they have to navigate their way through. They also manage to make huge intellectual and philosophical contributions, not only to their own small church communities, but really world tradition overall, and certainly our own Western tradition.